So in a in a conversation, if we remember what the point is, then we can keep asking ourselves how to listen to what is being said and always relate back to the point that is being made. And if we don't realize what the point of a conversation is, like if someone might just bring something up and they might start off with an intention of why they're bringing up a topic. They're going to try and make a point, and they may forget to tell you what point they're trying to make, and you as the listener may have to discern what point they're trying to make, which you may or may not be able to do because they might deliver the information in a way that doesn't make their point clear, because they might have a whole lot of thinking that they've done before that they might think you can read their mind about, but you can't. And so it can be very confusing. What can also happen is that the listener can miss what point they're making, even if the speaker specifically outlines the point, and then the listener is listening to what is being said without a frame of reference. So understanding the point of a conversation is very important, because it means that it allows the intellect to remain focused focused on what is being said relative to the point trying to be made. And in these teachings, the point is very much peace of mind, unbroken peace of mind for the human being in daily living. And unbroken peace of mind for the human being in daily living is described as, or called, happiness for the human being. Really, that's saying that happiness for the human being on a continuous, unbroken basis is available in the form of continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And continuous, unbroken peace of mind is not a feeling. It isn't a pleasurable feeling, but rather it is the absence of the uncomfortableness that is so common in life and arises in life. And it's that uncomfortableness which we can describe as a psychological uncomfortableness with oneself, or suffering, is an extra layer of uncomfortableness that is mental and exists on top of the pleasure or pain of the flow of life. And peace of mind is simply the absence of that extra layer of uncomfortableness. So the pleasure and pain of the flow of life is going to remain. That's just life unfolding, and it's always going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And peace of mind is the absence of the noise. And I don't mean physical noise, I mean a mental noise, which is essentially the psychological me in action that is really fighting life, fighting the other. It sees the other as a competitor, a rival, an enemy, and it sees life as a threat. Now, why do I mention that? That's the point. That's the point, the end of suffering. Peace of mind, the absence of suffering. So if we know that's the point, we can ask, well, why is the suffering there? And the suffering is there because what I'm calling a psychological identity gets formed. Now, what is that psychological identity? The psychological identity, for the purpose of the discussion of peace of mind, so it might not be that this actually really in technical terms is what the psychological identity is, but I think it's important for us to look at it like this relative to this point of peace of mind and daily living. So the psychological identity is essentially a structure. And because it's a structure, we could say it's um, it's real, not in the absolute sense, because actually at other times we'll say it's not real because of what its content, the content in the structure, the belief within the structure is a false belief. However, whether it's an accurate belief or a false belief, belief itself is essentially a structure. And because we're looking at ourselves as a human being on the level of daily living, we need to look at ourselves by and large as a biological entity. And so the psychological identity is a structure of belief. And so where does belief and belief structures reside? We could say they reside really in the neural networks of the brain. Now, they don't reside, or at least, as I said, I'm not a brain expert, so technically this might not be right, but as far as this point is, I think it's very useful to see it this way. And funnily enough, I think even though I'm not schooled in these things, I don't think the descriptions are that far off. So the psychological identity is a structure. It's a belief structure. Beliefs are essentially associated and related with the brain structure, and the brain structure is essentially a whole lot of neural networks. And so we can say the beliefs are in the neural networks, but they're not contained as information put into the neural network, as in the neural network is not a container and then the content of belief gets put in the container, but rather the belief itself is a specific result of the neural connections. So if you change your belief, we could look at it like the neural connections have changed just a little bit. And so it might be hard for us to comprehend the vast density and intricacy of the neural network. And essentially every time we're learning something, every time that we change our idea, it's because the neural network has changed in structure. Now, what forms our neural structures when it comes to this sense of who we are? We could look at it as being the way that we see life and the feedback that we get from life. And so the way we see life and the feedback we get is based on the neural structure. And so then there's a feedback loop which can in fact change the neural structure until it gets pretty much formed one way. So I guess when we're growing up, there's a lot of change happening, and that change starts to become more uniform until there's a sort of base in place. And that feedback loop doesn't stop happening, but it tends to become quite consistent as we start to see life out of a already formed structure. And so it takes something new and significant to come in to change that structure. But really, as soon as we understand something differently, especially if what we understand or information we receive is radically different in terms of what it means to, let's say, life overall, that new information can change the structure quite significantly. But let's also bear in mind that the structure has been put in place by a repeated feedback loop that confirms the structure. So it may be that that structure doesn't change easily. Now, that's also a result of how we receive the information. So we could get some information in that isn't opposed by a really ingrained, strong structure. And so the structure changes quickly because the information is received, because the structure isn't sort of pushing it out. And some, I guess, structures, some beliefs, which are turned into this psychological me, have the effect of essentially making some information non-palatable, and basically the information won't resonate. And if information doesn't resonate, it has less capacity to be absorbed. So this belief structure will sort of set up in itself defenses that push away information that is challenging to it or doesn't resonate with it. And this is part of the reason why spiritual teachings will or won't resonate with us, and it's part of the reason why it feels like life delivers exactly what we need at exactly the right time. Not because life is delivering exactly what we need at the right time, but rather because life is always delivering so much, and so much is being discarded as not relevant on what we could call a subconscious level. So we don't even realize that this filtering is happening. And so when something that is welcome or is needed comes in, and the system accepts it, then we feel drawn to it. We feel motivated to engage in it. And the opposite happens if information is sort of not appropriate, or not aligned with how the structure is or needs to, or is changing towards. If that's the case, it will sound unappealing and we won't spend much time on it. So because there is this psychological me, which is essentially, let's almost call it a physical structure, although we're talking about the physicalness of the brain and the neural structure. Now, the story that I'm putting forward, the description, the concepts about a brain and neural structure, they're not so important, because the point is not so much me trying to say this is how life is. The point is peace of mind in daily living, happiness for the human being. And this description, although I don't think it's actually misleading or inaccurate, I think from certain perspectives, it can be seen to be relatively adequate description, even if we were making a different point, even if the talk was more about specifically biology, then I don't think that someone would say this is absolutely wrong. But I'm not saying that it's absolutely spot on if we were talking about biology, but when it comes to this point of peace of mind, it's very important, and it's appropriate to look at it this way. So because the psychological me is essentially a deeply ingrained structure of the structure of the brain. So let's start looking at beliefs as contained structurally in the brain. And the belief is, this is who I am. This is what I need. This is what life is. This is what the other is. This is how I should act in life. This is how the other should act in life. This is what life, when it turns out this way, means about me. What I need in life is positive outcomes, pleasure. What I don't need in life is pain. What I need in life is pleasure in order to be more complete. What I don't need in life is pain to be less complete or attacked. Now, these are all of our ideas about life and oneself that in a very complex way, intertwine. And underneath, for example, what I need is pleasure, there will be a whole range of specific pleasures that we think we need, those things that we think are important to us, that feel important to us. So for some people it's material gain and money, for other people it's art or humanitarian efforts. And even within those broad categories, there will be a whole lot of subsets, which are essentially all of our attachments to preferences. So our preferences and then our attachment, which says this is what will make life okay. And so that complex structure is actually in place. And that's why we find it impossible, in a sense, to stop ourselves from thinking and feeling a certain way. So when we start looking at suffering, and remember, peace of mind, the absence or the falling away of suffering, and the concept that would be that's put forward in the teaching says the deeply ingrained sense of self, the psychological me, is essentially resting on two general premises, two general beliefs that underlie the psychological me, and that is that I am primarily a physical organism that is in control of everything I think, feel, say, and do. And that's what we refer to this belief in personal doership. And so that is an idea of myself as being a separate entity that has complete control and volition over everything that over how it functions and how it thinks and how it feels. The assumption is, okay, so once I was born, I was thrown out and I'm now separate and on my own and an independent entity. And so that idea of ourself sort of creates, if it's not real, it might, let's say that's not accurate, it has now created a psychological separation around the human being. So the human being sees themselves as separate because there is a belief that says I am a separate, independent entity in control of everything I think, feel, say, and do. So the belief in personal doership engenders a separation. It has to come with a separation from the others, and more importantly, from life and source. It's basically saying there's nothing that is controlling me. I am the controller. So I can't be connected to anything. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in control if I'm connected to something. Something else would be powering me or feeding me. And so the psychological me believes to be insulated and separate. And secondly, not only does it believe it to be the personal doer, which means I am the one that controls this entity, but that I require outcomes in order to be satisfied, content, complete, fulfilled in life. So the uncomfortableness that is there by default, as when this psychological me is in place, is believed and it's concluded, so that it becomes part of this psychological me, that the uncomfortableness is there because life isn't perfect yet, because I haven't got where I need to go. So the assumption is the uncomfortableness is because I need to rearrange the pieces on the board. Whereas in fact, the uncomfortableness is much more primary than that. It exists because this psychological me, which is not ever going to feel comfortable, in fact, it is inherently uncomfortable because it exists. So the uncomfortableness is not because of circumstance, but because this psychological me is put in place, which means because this specific neural setup is in place. And that psychological me is convinced that happiness is to be found in outcomes, and what it, in more practical terms, it really means success, being the best, being above the rest, being recognized, achieving outcomes that will set us apart. That's one broad categorization of what is meant by outcomes to the psychological me. I want to be able to compare myself to others and essentially see that I am worthy, which it equates with being sort of in the top 10%. And for someone else, it might be, oh, I'll be happy with being in the top 30%. But there is a place where we will say, okay, that's good enough. And that place means to the individual being better than others and being able to feel good about oneself because of one's achievements. So often the uncomfortableness is felt like a sense of purposelessness, like we feel like we need a purpose in life and that we just haven't found our passion. And the reason that that's what we feel is because the uncomfortableness is there, and then we're convinced that the uncomfortableness is because I haven't proved myself, and that if I prove myself, the uncomfortableness will go away. And so automatically we're desiring purpose. And so it then feels like I don't have a purpose, and when I find my purpose, everything will be okay. So creating things is something we're often drawn to, being creative, wanting to invent something. All of these things, wanting to be special, they're there because they give us a psychological solution, which happens to be the wrong psychological solution, but we don't realize it. The psychological me doesn't realize that that solution is wrong. It has set it up as being right. So when life unfolds, and if we don't find ourselves outperforming, the fact that we haven't outperformed can become a source of further uncomfortableness with oneself. So if we see our friends and neighbors moving ahead in terms of material progression, that can be a source of feeling like we really aren't keeping up with the Joneses. We really aren't good enough. And if the psychological me is convinced that that's where happiness is to be found, then that's going to be the feeling. And furthermore, you're not going to be able to not think along those lines, because to not think along those lines would actually be an act of self-disrespect when that psychological identity is in place, because it will be seen as an attack. It is registered as an attack on our happiness. So failing, not outperforming, in a very complex reaction, not something that we do consciously, is just going to make us feel inadequate and uncomfortable. Now, the solution, and if that psychological structure is in place, it's not optional. You might hear that your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And if hearing about that is heard in a way that it doesn't change the psychological structure, it's heard and we go, oh yeah, that sounds right. But let's say it sounds right and it feels like we're appreciating it. We haven't just discarded it. We say, oh, that sounds right. I get it. Yeah, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So it doesn't look like we're discarding, but let's say it only goes in to a certain level and it doesn't change the structure much. Then what happens is, as soon as we find ourselves comparing ourselves to the other, or find the potential for comparison to happen, but basically just seeing someone else turn up in a new car or invite you to the housewarming of their new house. And you go in, you find that it's a beautiful house with all this modern furniture and great art and well designed. And you might go in and feel really inadequate. And that's because the understanding that one's happiness isn't to be found in outcomes hasn't changed the structure. So essentially the structure still believes that what we are is something that is defined by success, by outcomes. So the other pleasure that is deeply, deeply craved is love. Now, actually, love probably is deeper than the desire for success. Really, the desire for success is there because we believe it will give us love. If not love from the other, then the capacity for self-love, because we can stop beating ourselves up for not being good enough. But essentially, we can look at love and material gain as two categories that humans are very prone to craving, because there is this belief that either love or success is where we will feel complete and where our completeness comes from. So if the structure is in place and then life circumstance unfolds in a way that when life delivers pain, often through the other, we start to feel this uncomfortableness. And that uncomfortableness is our unhappiness, and happiness is the end of the uncomfortableness. What is the answer? And the answer is the psychological me has to change. As the psychological me starts to change, and let's look at it as dissolving. So it changes, but essentially the false sense of self as change happens is essentially dissolving. And so when it's dissolved completely, it can't then produce the same uncomfortable outputs that it did before. And this change is reliant on us really starting to deeply see, deeply acknowledge, not just giving it lip service or thinking about it in a rudimentary way, but because we might think about something in a rudimentary way and think we're really deeply thinking about it. But we need to go deep in and say, I acknowledge, I really don't understand what is being said because the suffering is happening, and I really need to understand this. I really need to deeply get it. And the teachings are saying what we really are at our core is contentment, is peace, is free from suffering. That the human being is not going to feel content, fulfilled, and at peace because of success, because of love, because of material gain. And similarly, if those things are taken away from us, if we are connected to the core of who we are, the removal of those things is not an attack on who we really are. Now, hearing it is one thing. Understanding it in a way that changes the ingrained identity is another thing, but it starts with the deepening, starts with understanding it intellectually, and then investigating it, contemplating it, hearing more and more on the topic, and hopefully as things are described about the topic, maybe fine details or nuances or something is described slightly differently than it is a lot of the other time, the picture starts to fill out. And as the picture starts to fill out, as we start to understand more and more of it, that's the changing of the psychological me. And as the picture starts to fill out, which means someone can say something and it's that really helped. That allowed me to think about it differently. And then the thinking has to turn into a feeling-based thinking. A thinking that is not devoid or disconnected from actuality, because it's very easy to go into the head thinking. And into the head thinking means we believe that we're thinking about life. And the point of thinking about this is to become connected and to see it, to see that which is that is there, that is covered up. And if we go into this cavern of our head, we can create these models about what we're thinking about. But the model gets created based on how we've heard the concept and what we're thinking about it. So we create a model about like a visualization of life and what is being said. And without realizing it, we're in a cavern that is outside of daily life. Thinking about daily life, trying to understand daily life while being in a cavern that is not daily life. And so this thinking, still thinking, but while being on the body level, is a very significant shift that happens. And until it's described that we can be in a thinking cavern in the head and be really thinking about daily life, but not in it, and therefore getting it wrong on the fine detail. Whereas if we're in it and we're thinking about it while looking at the dynamics of daily life, then our thinking is influenced by the details we're actually seeing while investigating daily life. And this hit me while I was seeking this phenomena of being lost in thinking without realizing that we're lost in a cavern, which is often referred to in the head. We don't realize it because the thoughts in the cavern are about daily life. And so it seems like we're in daily life because we're thinking about daily life. And when this difference between actually being in the environment of daily life and then thinking about daily life while being in direct contact with the environment that you're thinking about, as opposed to creating a virtual environment and then investigating the virtual environment. And hopefully we can realize that the virtual environment we're creating is an environment of daily life based on our current understanding, which may be quite limited, or not necessarily limited, but off in certain regards. So I remember realizing this when I started to notice that people would ask me, for example, how are you today? And I would answer it from my head. And I picked up on this because I noticed my eyes looking upwards to find the answer. And I think I must have seen a documentary or something like that that talked about how when we engage certain parts of the brain, our eyes will look upwards, move into the top right-hand corner of the eye socket or something like that, whatever. And when different parts of our thinking are activated, we will look differently. And that information coincided with spiritual teachings that were talking about how we have to feel and not think and be connected to the present moment. And in one fine moment, there was a click that said, wow, I'm answering this question from my head. Whereas the question is, how do you feel today? So I realized I'm not really answering the question, given I'm going to my head, which is not where I'm feeling. And I realized that the answer would not be really an accurate answer, but rather a social answer, which is really much to do with strategy of the mind, or and so I thought, if we're being authentic, if this aim is to be keeping it real, to be connected to the present, and that the body is a doorway to that, then I thought, well, I should answer the question accurately. Now the point is not about specifically giving the other person a correct answer to that question, because often people ask it simply as small talk, and you might start to notice that people aren't really interested in knowing how you feel, especially if you're not that great, for example, or if you go into a very long, detailed explanation about all the ways you feel today. So it may not be socially appropriate to answer the question from feeling. However, when you're looking at authenticity for yourself and you realize, at least in principle, where authenticity is being missed, it can become very useful to say, oh, at least I need to practice feeling and knowing an answer to that question, whether it's appropriate to give or not in the circumstance. I can discern in the actual moment, but I need to become skilled at being able to answer the question based on feeling. And it can be as simple as that. Something as simple as that. You hear an explanation and you realize that you're not connected to the body. And that can help bring a shift to connecting into the body, which allows you to then be in the cavern of daily life instead of the virtual imagination of thought of daily life. And so now you can investigate when I say the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. When you're feeling in the body, and you're in the body and you're able to feel your experience, you might have a backache. You can go, there's the pain in the moment. And so now the sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain is not just a concept. It's a concept that has always been pointing to daily life. And so you can become more intimate with what the concept is really talking about. Whereas in the cavern of our mind, we can't ever really bump into pleasure or pain in the way it's pointing at. And even emotional pleasure or pain, which is more linked to thinking, or has a component of thought in it, so emotional pleasure and pain is different to the psychological suffering. Emotional pleasure or pain is based on a pain that is not physical. It's not the same as having a backache or stubbing your toe, or being in a shower that's too cold or too hot. That's obviously physical pleasure or pain. Emotional pleasure or pain is simply, for example, having a pet that you enjoy the company of, and at some point the pet comes to the end of its life, and so you now no longer have the company of the pet. And so in that period where the pet dies, it makes sense that you're not overjoyed and excited and clapping at the fact your pet has died, right? That would be emotional pleasure. And it doesn't make sense to have emotional pleasure when something emotionally painful happens. And so we can have emotional pain that doesn't need to turn into suffering. So you can have sadness. That sadness can be pervaded with love, where you have a gratitude to the fact that you got to share 12 years with a cat, for example, that you loved. And even though that's not there anymore, you can feel that there is love, there is gratitude. And furthermore, the loss of the cat doesn't mean that part of you is now missing. It doesn't mean that you are incomplete, because that would be the case. You will feel complete if your sense of self is not attached to outcomes. Now, not being attached to outcomes doesn't mean it's not a sad event. So you can feel sad, and that sadness will penetrate only so far. It won't penetrate and turn into uncomfortableness on your level of self. So even emotional pleasure and pain, which has a link to thoughts, let's say a thought about the cat that you loved and cared about, even that requires you to feel it on the body level. And even the thinking of the working mind is known more clearly on the body level. So you can be connected to the body and still aware of the thinking, which is actually a function of the body. So the brain is part of the body and thinking is part of the brain. And so by being connected to the body, we still have awareness of the brain, which is part of the body, and awareness of thinking. However, if we go and get lost in one part of the body, like the brain or the mind, if we are absorbed into one part of the body, then we lose access to the rest of it. So when we talk about coming into the body and feeling, it's not about coming into one part of the body. It's coming into the heart, you could say, the heart of the body, where you have awareness of the whole body, including the mental aspects. And so it's from this place that we can start to investigate the concepts and hear the concepts in a way that has more capacity to sink in deeper and deeper. And as the concepts, as the understanding, as the appreciation of what's being pointed at starts to develop, that's where the psychological me really starts to change. And so if we find ourselves drawn in to a teaching where it becomes the priority, so if you find yourself seeking when suffering arises, unfortunately, and so this isn't a criticism in the sense of you are not good enough as a doer, it's more a discernment or a description. If someone is drawn into seeking only when they start to suffer, and then when the suffering isn't there, seeking becomes irrelevant and they're off trying to get pleasure and pain, that's a sign of, ripe is a term that's used to describe the earnest seeker, which really means not because of their, their special efforts, but because life has shaped them such that they are what we would call ripe or earnest, which means they will be interested in this, not as a means of getting rid of intense suffering in that particular moment, but more about interested in it as a form of curiosity, like wanting to know, not just to solve a problem, but because this is an important question. Who am I? What is life? Not asking that just to solve a problem. I mean, in a way, a bit like someone who will pray to God only when things go wrong. You know, it makes sense that maybe if there was a God that delivers answers to your prayers, he might say, listen, you know, we can't have this sort of relationship. You come running only when something goes wrong and expect me to be dishing out everything you want. And yet, you know, if one is earnest and has a real friendship, relationship, that means that's a one that is based on more than just wanting something. So if we find ourselves drawn into seeking, where it becomes the most important thing, where there is a natural motivation that keeps taking us deeper, keeps being there day after day after day. It doesn't have to be every single day, but you know, we can have breaks where we don't feel like it. And yet, if we look back on a year or 2 years and we go, "Wow, I've spent a lot of time seeking," not because I am so good, look at me, but because it's destiny, because life has shaped us that way. So if that's happening, that's earnest seeking, and that's the sort of seeking that has results, because it's repetitive, because it's wearing off layer after layer. It's hopefully allowing us to see life more and more as it's described in the pointers. So the psychological me is essentially a set of ideas about who we are, and at its core there is this sense that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and that's deeply believed. And so we really do need to start touching on a causeless happiness, a happiness that's available right now, a happiness that is available even when things aren't perfect. What happens when we're seeking happiness in the future, we might start to see, you know, I'm putting my happiness off. And maybe for, we might say, a year and a half before this project is over. And so we sort of put our happiness off until this happens, until something happens. And then we get to the end of that year and a half and it hasn't eventuated as we thought. It's been pushed out to another 2 years. And so then we put our happiness off again because we're trying to get there. We're working on it. And then maybe we get it and we've set some other goal up by then, because not ironically, because actually those goals are never going to really deliver the happiness. So we get there, and by the time we've got there, we've already looked out further ahead. So we put our happiness off for another 5 years, and eventually we wake up to the fact that, you know, life is not going to go on forever. And if I keep putting my happiness off, at some point I'm going to get news that says, you know, things are coming to an end. And we're going to look back at all these years that we kept putting it off and realize that's not the way to do it. It might be okay, you know, if we could put it off for 3 years and then after 3 years it was there, and then we had 70 years. And that's okay. That's a good payoff balance. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. It's quite the opposite. So the good news is that It isn't out there. And if we start feeling it, because we really start believing it, maybe we just see how much we do believe that it is out there, how uncomfortable we feel when we compare ourselves to others and feel not good enough. And maybe realize that all suffering, this uncomfortableness, is all based on thought. That if you didn't compare yourself, if you turn the TV off, if you turn Facebook off, if you don't go to social gatherings or parties where there are all these people that are very successful, where you automatically compare yourself to them, if that is turned off, you might start to feel how after a week or two, certain thoughts that you used to have because of your environment triggering it all the time aren't there anymore. And that's when you might have your own first-hand experience about, maybe this is the simple happiness, where that type of thinking gets less and less, or even non-existent. But, it's very subtle. These triggers trigger us, and they trigger the suffering, and the suffering is about the circumstance. And so we're convinced that it's about the circumstance rather than the attitude. So if we're fortunate to start seeing the subtle difference between, or really seeing the strength, the power of the thinking that is inspired by a particular, or is a particular attitude to circumstance. And so comparison, which really is a form of judgment on oneself. So you compare yourself to someone else that you've placed up higher on the human validity scale, and therefore you're feeling guilty of not being as good as you want to be, or should be, or could be. If you take that benchmark away, you find that actually the thinking has nothing to think about. We might actually find ourselves resting in the present moment, where we start appreciating the fact that I exist. This may highlight to us how our thinking, the thinking of the psychological me, that which we can call the thinking mind, which is distinct from the working mind, that is functional thinking. And functional thinking doesn't include this uncomfortableness of oneself in it. We might start to see that the thinking mind thinking is essentially looking at everything we don't have and ignoring everything we have. Everything we have includes our health, if we're healthy. It includes the very fact that we're here, that I exist. And if our thinking about circumstance, and as if circumstance is the most important, as that starts to fall away, that which we already have, that which is given, the air to breathe. Imagine if air wasn't here, then we'd have a real problem. Then we'd have something to complain about. God's given us air. Every moment it's given to us. The sense of existence, meaning the aliveness that and the functioning of the body, is here. And that's the core of the human being, is what I am prior to the thinking mind kicking in. So the thinking mind is essentially a veil of uncomfortableness based on an idea of who I am that is missing what I really am. The majority of what the human being is being taken for granted and ignored. So if we come back to what we are, and in the present moment, we might realize that life itself, just being alive, is more than enough. We might also realize that so much of our involvement in circumstance, we go out looking for things to be passionate about, and often what makes us feel alive, which is not really alive, but makes the sense of self feel alive, either valid or at least my psychological self is activated, is if we are seeing the other as the enemy, seeing the other as a competitor, making the other wrong, which is the flip side of looking at the other, comparing them and making them much better than us. There is another movement, which is I need to be in opposition to the other. And so we're creating our own uncomfortableness by being involved in circumstance that you can easily just step out of the ring from. And, well, when I say you could easily, not if this psychological me is in place, because if the psychological me is in place, it's drawn to go looking for that. Just like it's drawn to go looking for pleasurable outcomes where it thinks it's going to be complete. This gives it a sense of being something, being a victim in a lot of cases, being a savior, being the rebel, being the one who's not going to be told what to do, simply being in resistance by and large. Now, I'm not talking about lying down and not doing what you can to fix a situation. Acceptance doesn't mean seeing a water pipe in the garden break and then sitting there and just looking at it. Acceptance means accept that the water pipe is broken, accept that fixing it and getting a great outcome may not be in your control. You're not in control of the outcome. And yet, acceptance doesn't mean to not do your best to improve the situation where you can, knowing that the outcome is not in your control. And so with acceptance, the thinking mind that functions on a non-pragmatic basis, that is basically there and will spend 3 hours complaining about the broken water pipe and not doing anything about it. That part of our thinking mind, when there is acceptance, is absent. And then the biological intelligence will do what it can to fix the water pipe. It will call a plumber, or it will go to the shed and get its tools and fix it itself. And in either case, you might call the plumber and the plumber says he'll be there in half an hour, and 3 hours later he's still not there. The plumber might come and 2 hours later the water pipe breaks open again. You might try to fix it, and 2 hours later the water pipe breaks open, or you fix it and in the meantime you damage your hand. All of those are outcomes that are not ideal, not in line with your biological preferences, and all of that can happen. It's not in your control. The outcome's not in your control. And similarly, you can get a positive outcome. The plumber may come, He may not charge you very much. You may fix it yourself and be impressed that, you fixed something that you've never tried to do before. So without the thinking mind, the complaining, the blaming, the shaming, the resistance to what has happened falls away, and you get to function biologically, which is do your best to improve the situation, knowing that the outcome is not in your control. And the same with social issues, with economic issues, political issues. If they really are significant to you, and there's something you can do practically, do it. And once you've done it, that's it. You can sit back and wait and see what the outcome is. You'll see that most of the engagement in these situations is not at all pragmatic and practical action, but psychological complaining and resisting. Usually because it may have an impact on us in terms of delivering something we don't like, and instead of seeing that even so it may be a good result overall, we're not interested in looking at the bigger picture, and we're just resisting it because of a short-term pain that it's delivering. And really that means that it's our attachment to outcome that is driving us to be violently in opposition to something simply because it's delivering pain in the moment to us. And pain in the moment is part of life. And a lot of time it's inevitable. As I said, if there's something you can do to change pain into pleasure, to improve a situation, by all means do it. But understand that you're not necessarily always going to be able to turn pain into pleasure. And at some point, once you've done what you can, sitting back, understanding you've done what you can, and understanding it's destiny for, in this situation, there to be pain in the moment. So just before we go to questions, maybe I'll talk about this tomorrow, but I wanted to throw in the notion that everything is happening according to God's will. What we are is not the doer. Now, once again, why is this relevant? Not to have a discussion with someone to prove that point. That's not the point. The point is happiness in daily living. And once again, being able to see life as a creation that we can say is the creation of God or source. Now, I don't mean a religious God. I mean a creation of a source. And not necessarily a creation outside of the source either. It can be, and I would suggest that it's good to look at it like this, that source has become the creation. Source has become the whole creation. Now, if we can start to look at life from inside the creation as a point of creation, so you and I are conscious beings with intelligence, we start to ask, what does it mean, all of this? Whatever is happening, the fact that the table is there and that it's that color and that shape, the fact that I am in this room at this moment and that the wind is blowing and that the light is flickering and that I'm having certain thoughts and that there is this sound in your environment, which is, let's say we call it Roger's voice. What does it mean that all that is exactly the way it is according to God's will? And all of that is part of a singular creation that in essence is not made up of separate bits. Now, that's quite radical because it's not how life is experienced. It's not how life is interpreted by our senses. And it's not how our model puts together and relates to life. And yet I would say that in spiritual seeking, as it becomes more and more well, let's say as it gets closer to understanding oneself, as we get closer to peace of mind and daily living, being able to hold a model that can understand more than just intellectually, but really say, yeah, I can, from my own experience, I can run with that sentiment that life is a happening according to God's will, and that it is it's a singularity. It is a non-dual creation. That everything is happening exactly as it's determined to happen, or it's unfolding inevitably. Now, so if we say everything is predetermined, once again, someone can hear the word predetermined and get focused on the word pre, and that can inspire the presupposition of time and before and after. And that time before or after doesn't necessarily fit in with the notion of everything is one and it's not separate. So when I talk about predetermination, the point is not predetermination itself. The point is happiness for the human being in daily living. And remember, happiness in daily living is very much related to this psychological identity, because the psychological identity, which is a structure that has been put in place because of how we experience life, how we know life, how we know life is not separate from that structure. And that structure, which is how we know life, how we've come to know ourselves in life, is responsible, or is why uncomfortableness in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation arises. And so if the point is peace of mind, then let's remember that, because peace of mind is very relevant to the structure, in fact relevant in such a way that when the structure dissolves, we have peace of mind, because the structure being there, the psychological structure, the neural structure in this explanation, when that's there, there is suffering, which is the opposite of peace of mind, or what disturbs the peace of mind, that which fills the space that can be silent and still. So predetermination is a very important concept relevant to, or relative to, the point, which is peace of mind and daily living. And everything happening exactly as it's happening in this moment, all according to God's will. This needs to be an attitude that we start developing, fostering, inquiring into. How can it be? And it's got a lot to do with understanding that the nature of life, the nature of experience, is not physical. That what we interpret as and relate to as a physical world is not exactly that. That the bird flying across the horizon, the sound of the bird singing, or the dog barking, or the cars hooting, all of that is not physical. The tree is not physical. The room is not physical. We experience it that way. We experience it as physical. So everything is happening according to God's will. It's a spontaneous arising in consciousness, and an important part of coming to know that, to feel it, to be it, is to question the physicality, to question the timeness of life. So life is often described as formless, or reality is often described as formless, as infinite, as eternal. Infinite means the absence of space, eternal means the absence of time. Formless is the absence of form. How is it that all of this embodies those attributes? All of life is an arising inside of awareness, made of awareness, witnessed by awareness. The physicality is an experience known by awareness. The thoughts are thought objects, just like the physical objects, or at least those that we experience as physical, are objects arising in consciousness. Now, when I use the word object, I'm not using it in the traditional sense, because object usually means something separate, something form-like and tangible. So I'm using the word objects, sight objects, sound objects, physical objects, as objects of consciousness or objects of awareness. Not separate from awareness, made of awareness. Now, the psychological me is deeply ingrained because life has been seen a particular way. So the seeing life a particular way has resulted in a deeply ingrained psychological me. Seeing life radically differently, questioning, having that which we assume to be true shown to be not as true as we might have thought, can coexist or coincide with a radical change of the sense of the psychological me. And if the psychological me gets rattled and changed, the psychological suffering changes. You know, I often spend a lot of time on the causal explanation of non-doership, the causal explanation of how everything is happening exactly the way it's destined to happen. And if I talk about causality, by default we might find ourselves simultaneously reinforcing the notion of physicality, the notion of time, as an absolute, as absolute in and of themselves. So when we talk about life is predetermined, or happening according to God's will, on the one hand, I don't like doing it because it's sort of a bit like a belief. And someone can just believe it and say, you know, you keep telling us it's predetermined according to God's will. And I, Roger, don't like putting unsubstantiated claims forward. One of the big problems is that we have believed, our brain has formed structures that are a certain way because the brain has assumed things to be absolute, and often what it believes to be absolute is based on a cursory acceptance of what it's been told, and a cursory assessment of life. Cursory meaning on the surface, really, not going very deep. And so it's the dissolving of belief that that leads to significant change. And so I tend not to like to just put out broad statements that humans are prone to believe. And yet, if you put in too much explanation, and the explanation that is needed in order for something to be understood without it being belief, is usually detailed and causal. So if we only go that route, then that in itself can keep us within a certain paradigm. So open up to the looking at life with an openness that is aware. So come into the body, be aware of life with an openness where everything is seen as the space in which life is happening in this moment. So we don't need to see the universe out beyond Jupiter and Mars. It's enough to be here in the room. The room, in practical terms, is the universe. It is the creation that I'm talking about, arises spontaneously and is predetermined. We only need to be present with what is predetermined or what is created, what is arising in this moment. And so being open and aware of the present moment as far as the field of awareness goes. So whatever fits into your field of awareness. As far as any visual objects are inside your field of awareness, any sound objects have to be inside of your field of awareness, otherwise you wouldn't be able to be aware of them. That is the universe in practical terms for the purpose of this investigation. And start to relate to what's happening as that which is predetermined, that which is the creation of God unfolding. So if a butterfly flies past you, see that as try and understand, how can this be? And that is an experience in consciousness, not just the butterfly, but the whole space in which the butterfly exists and the person aware of the butterfly exists. And notice that there is awareness of the person that is aware of the butterfly. And drop into being the awareness in which the person and the butterfly are happening. Life is a happening according to God's will. The thoughts inside what we would say the body are really thoughts, objects arising within the space of presence. The thought might be, what a wonderful butterfly. And the body that is watching the butterfly is witnessed by awareness in which it arises. And the thought that says, what a wonderful butterfly, is also witnessed by awareness in which it arises. And the awareness is not separate from the thought. If the awareness was separate from the thought would not be known. Essentially, everything that arises within the field of awareness is inside and pervading and pervaded by awareness. All there is awareness. The human body is an object within awareness. The body is moving and feeling exactly as it's destined to do in that moment. All like a night dream. If you look at a night dream, it's a creation in consciousness. And everything in the night dream happens according to the source of the dream. The dream is arising inside a consciousness made. The ocean in the dream is made of mind and witnessed by mind. So the word mind can be, take the notion of mind as being bigger than the human. Take the notion of mind as being that in which the experience of life, including the experience of the human, exists. And we're so used to assuming that the human has a mind. Maybe the human arises inside mind. And in this context, mind would be a synonym for awareness. The nature of mind is awareness. Okay, we'll take some questions. Hi, Vensh. Hello, Vensh. Hi, Schumann.
Oh, hello. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Yes. No, thank you very much for the talk. It really did resonate, both today's and yesterday's. It,
You're welcome.
yeah, it really rang true. I think what I wanted to say, although the answer, I think I already know the answer. I'm only just asking the question just to run it through with you. But I just wanted to say, firstly, the thinking mind, or the sense of doership. It seems to me there's a Sanskrit word called dukkha, which means sadness. And I think the original meaning of the word, it comes from the wheel of a cart. And when the wheel isn't functioning properly, it wobbles a little bit and creates a bump.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that is what the thinking mind, or the sense of doership, is. It is that disharmony, or the lack of flow. Whereas when there is the awareness that there is no doership, then it's going to flow. That's when the wheel works properly.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yes. Yeah.
So the doer is essentially a psychological resistance. So it's sort of like the bump in the wheel. If we look at it like that, it's like the doer is the bump in the wheel, and if the doer is not there, then the bump in the wheel isn't there. But it's important to when we're using this example to see that the doer is not a physical component of the wheel, but it's this psychological addition that creates resistance rather than the wheel itself. So maybe the analogy doesn't lend itself perfectly either. So as long as we're clear that the doership creates a mental resistance with life, and when that mental resistance falls away, we find that the human mind is in flow with life, meaning allowing life to flow. And the doer is sort of pushing against the flow of life.
Okay. I think my question does relate to mental resistance. I mean, firstly, you emphasize that you don't like to talk about beliefs, because I think beliefs can be quite robotic and they can stop you from exploring things. So when you talk about everything is predetermined, there's a danger that could be seen as a type of belief. But there's also this thing, the appearance of free will. And so maybe it shows that even though everything is predetermined, it is also dynamic, because it is me in process. As I think you said the other day, we are still in the Big Bang. This is all the Big Bang, but the Big Bang is a living thing. It's not a dead thing, and hence that's why this sense that I have free will is there. Perhaps it's an expression of the that it's not a mechanical process. It's a living process, perhaps. But
Yes, I think people struggle with free predetermination, meaning no free will, because just because of how the word predetermined is seen, it sort of implies that there's not going to be any change because it's predetermined. So, well, it's going to happen the way it is determined to happen. But as you're pointing out, what is determined, i.e., what is in place, is change. So that means, if I say your life is predetermined, someone imagines, oh well, in that case, my life is a straight line. But on that line, essentially, at some point, the person, because it's predetermined, might have the thought, I'm going to go to university. And that may take them not off their predetermined line, but keep them on their predetermined line. And in that moment, so let's say 3 years from now, the person has this thought that says, I'm going to go to university, and they go straight to university and they sign up. And that is predetermination happening, because it was always predetermined for them to, in that moment, apparently change their life from the course it was on. And I think when people hear predetermined, they imagine a straight line, whereas in fact, the predetermined line includes massive change sometimes. So if we reinterpret it that way, and people say, but people often say, but we have some wiggle room in there of free will. And the reason that they say there's some wiggle room is because they know from their experience that in any moment they can have this wild thought that says, I'm going to, go back to university at age 50, let's say. And they say, well, that's my free will. I can do that if I want. And I say, well, you can't. It's either all predetermined or it's not at all predetermined. But if it's all predetermined, I know that doesn't preclude someone from having the thought, I'm going to go back to university. And in fact, I'd say that thought is what was predetermined. And if they do go back to university, it was predetermined from the beginning of time for them to go to university.
yes, I think that is the sense that I get. There is just one thing, but I think I've got in a way, you've communicated the answer, but because it's a problem that I've had for quite a while, I just want to run it with you. And that is, it's just a fear of where we're going. And I probably overthought this, but we do live in a dualistic world with a lot of cruelty, and cruelty also implies manipulation. And I have brought up this thing about the Gnostics, but the Gnostics were killed by the Romans. Every single one of them was murdered, and all their texts were destroyed, except for the Nag Hammadi, which somehow survived in Egypt in an earthenware jar. It was discovered in the 1940s. And it's not just the Romans. I think the ancient Chinese did the same thing. They persecuted certain spiritual groups, and they had to go underground. They don't mind religions with a structure so much because they can be incorporated into the political structure. But things which become like non-duality, where there's no clear authority or priests, sometimes that can be a challenge to the powers that be. And my worry is, at this point of time, we're quite pluralistic, and so I don't think there's any problem with non-duality. There's probably people even at the higher echelons of government who are very much into non-duality. But my only worry is, and this is due to a video with Ray Kurzweil, the chief executive of Google. He was talking about the way humans are going to move forward. And he predicted, it might be a bit, his prediction is probably a bit too quick, I think, but he believes that by 2030, we will be able to just think a thought to Google and Google will give us the answer. And I think that that's not something to be welcome, because potentially the powers that be will know exactly what you're thinking. And later in 2045, he talks about merging with the, going into a virtual world where you'll have virtual bodies and things like that, and a completely different sense of self. Once again, an emphasis on going deeper into another illusion. And it is I've probably overthought this, but it's my worry, because our society is dysfunctional in terms of the cruelty, the big gap between the rich and poor. It needs dysfunctional people, or people who have a sense of self-identity for it to run. Whereas if you have people who are really healthy, who begin to see through the illusion, they're the type of people that society doesn't want, which is probably why the Romans destroyed the Gnostics. And I thought it could be done at a more sophisticated level with the use of technology, where people are encouraged to be identified, this time with a virtual self and things like that. But then again, I'm also thinking everything ultimately is also God's will anyway. It's not in my control, but it is a fear. That is a fear that runs through at the back of my mind. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So one of the very powerful question, I guess it is, and it becomes something that arises inside us. So it can be a question that I throw at you, and it can also be something that starts arising within you, and that is, who cares? So the question I can ask is, who cares? And it's a very nice thing when you play with it. Who cares? Because it's when it arises inside of us, it can arise as who cares? It's not important, and it's very authentic when it arises inside of us. Who cares? It's usually a response to seeing our thinking mind turning something that our true self really doesn't care about, and seeing how the thinking mind can grab something that the thinking mind thinks is important and turn it into a fear, let's say, or a thinking point that the thinking mind gets obsessed about, and hopefully we can start to feel when it's turning into suffering, because often we don't feel the thinking mind as suffering until we start to become more finely tuned and our attention lands on it. And then, these fears that we have tend to be fears about the future. And they can seem like they're very valid concerns. from a certain perspective. But the truth is they're disturbing our sense of being here now, because it will come in and it will make the future what's relevant. And that thinking and that fear, if it is an uncomfortableness with oneself, if it is fear, and if it is part of the thinking mind, it needs to get cut off. And it gets cut off when the part of us inside that realizes there's a certain scope of thinking that really is based on ignorance, an ignorance of not knowing oneself, not knowing the part of oneself. And that's when it gets spotted, inside it says, actually, who cares? And so if I ask you the question now, who cares? It's different. No, I'm not saying who cares like I don't really have a big concern about that. That's my internal feeling. But I'm not saying that to be disrespectful. When I ask the question to you now, who cares? I'm asking it as in who question mark, like who cares? And you'll find that you might say, well, I care. I say, who? Who is this I that cares? And depending on how strongly the psychological me is in that moment, it's like, what do you mean? I care. But as we investigate it, we'll find, oh, the thinking mind cares. And if we drop into being, beingness is not interested in the past and the future. It's not interested in if it will be. It's interested in the fact that it is now. So this can sound very conceptual, like, oh, well, you're ignoring real problems. That's how the thinking mind will justify it. But really, maybe it's completely the other way around.
Now, what you said really resonates. When you asked the question, immediately what came to me, it is the thinking mind which cares. It is the thinking mind. But I think it's what it's also saying is it seems too easy. Shouldn't I be doing something or be more active? You know, it's saying that I need to be on my guard. Things can't be that simple.
The problem is you can spend a lot of time being on your guard and see that you don't really do anything. It's sort of like, someone says, I need to be on my guard about, I don't know, nuclear wars or financial breakdowns and worrying and thinking about all of this. But the truth is that if the economic system breaks down, all of your preparation and your thinking about it, it hasn't really put you anywhere further ahead than someone who hasn't thought about it, because there's certain events that you'll know about when they're happening. And so, sure, if your thinking has prepared you in the sense that you have a bunker that is nuclear war-proof and you have food and all of that, that's a different sort of preparation. That's like a pragmatic preparation. Not that I think that the nuclear war, if it happens, is going to turn out just like you imagine it will and your preparations will work. The likelihood is you've spent 20 years preparing and it doesn't work. Yeah. So my point being is, if you are going to feel like you need to do something, make sure it's not just worrying, but rather that the worrying is actually making a pragmatic difference. And the truth is, for a lot of these big questions, there just isn't anything you can do. So having said it's the thinking mind, what you've pointed out is an observation and a discernment that can very much fit into the working mind category as well, as long as it then doesn't turn into, oh my God, what am I going to do? Because the truth is that civilizations have been developing and then crashing on a fairly regular cycle for thousands of years, and the peak of a civilization and then the crash of a civilization includes often the burning of all of the intellectual texts and the collapse of culture, and then it needs to be sort of reinvented by and large by the next wave. And so what we are doing is in large part reinventing what's already been invented, realized, and burnt through the collapse of civilizations. The only difference is that previous civilizations, I think, have had intellectual superiority over where we are, as in terms of deep realizations, but within a less developed world of technology. So the technology is continuing to get more advanced. So as time goes on, civilizations become more complex in a way. But I don't think that the wisdom that developed in previous civilizations is necessarily more advanced in the later civilizations, and this comes down to understanding something like mathematics, for example, as a language. If we understand that, and I don't think most of us understand that mathematics is an underlying language that doesn't really it gets discovered in a sense. And I think that maybe civilizations a long time ago discovered the fundamentals of something like mathematics, and then it was lost, and then it gets rebuilt up again. And so it is a worry, but it's sort of, well, it's not really a worry if you don't worry about it. It's an actual phenomena that happens. So what you're pointing out to me is an actual phenomena that happens, but I don't think we need to worry about it.
Yes, it makes sense. Or maybe a good example is an exam where you can prepare for an exam, but otherwise it's the waste of energy if you can't do anything about it. Yes.
Yeah.
That is true. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you once again. Thanks, Roger.
You're welcome. We'll take one more question, I think. Hi, Peter. I think you have. Okay, here I've got you now. Unfortunately, you've got no audio, Peter, so maybe try on another day. Okay, who's next?
Purnor.
Hi, Purnor. You have to unmute yourself, Purnor.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Hello. It's so wonderful to attend your sessions. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
You're welcome.
So I just wanted to discuss this point that after this teaching has been introduced to me, it feels like that the temperament has been coming to a different state. Like I used to be very aggressive. I used to have a lot of anger in me. But as the teaching is settling down, it's like everything is also being mild. So is it like, am I going to a point, or is it like um, there's this sort of spinelessness, or the in order to not bother the equanimity or something like that, and disguise of that I am just being weak or something. I don't know if I was able to put out my question in a nice way, but just wanted to hear your opinion about it.
Yeah, I don't think that we should categorize the understanding as leading to a complete rolling over, because in certain situations, I think we can find biologically that we can become very firm if needed. Um, so I would hesitate to generalize that that is a characteristic of the understanding in an absolute sense. However, I do think that a lot of the aggression that we used to find ourselves with was very much part of the repressed doership and attachment to outcomes, this identity that has this load of repressed uncomfortableness behind it. And so a lot of our reaction to life was based on this resentment and what else? Was seeing the other as someone we had to dominate or win against, or fight back against, or hold our ground against. And you can see it on the roads. I laugh. I really laugh at the moment when I go driving. I tend to move slowly in life a lot of the time, and I think that rushing and squeezing a lot of things in, when you can afford to not do that, is great. And so it's fantastic when you're going from one place to the other and you're not in a rush. But the thing is, everyone else is in a rush. And so if you're driving a little bit slow in front of someone else, I really laugh at how angry people get on the road, because you're sort of like a Sunday driver. And I don't even mean really going slow. I mean on the speed limit, or just 5 kilometers below the speed limit, but they really want to be 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers above the speed limit because they're in a rush. And so you, as the slow driver, are effectively attacking them by being in their way. And it's so easy and obvious to see this anger coming out. It's just on the surface, coming out from the other. So when this attitude of trying to win and needing to win, and the attitude of trying to get more and more starts to come out of life, I think we become more relaxed. And if someone's driving slow, you're not necessarily driving fast or needing to go fast, so it's less of an attack on your plans. So and also, if someone has an idea that is not in line with your concepts or your beliefs, hopefully you've opened up to the fact that that's okay. That's just a concept, their concept, and it doesn't define who I am. And so there's less reason to have to fight back and defend your concept against their concept. You can sort of just walk away. You don't have to be exposed to it, or you can And it's not even about walking away, you just don't take it personally. So I think as long as we can understand that at times when needed we will be able to be forceful, that it makes sense that a lot of the aggression and attitudes you're talking about fall away.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So thanks for joining, and we'll be back, well, not tomorrow, but on Saturday.